Just the ones that are not talking.
I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to the fourth and final of these fall history presentations here at Second. You'll recall that we started with the history of Presbyterianism in the state, and specifically in Louisville, and at Second with Dr. Patrick Lewis of the Filson Historical Society in the early founding days of Louisville. And then we went to the antebellum and Civil War history of Second that was taught by David Ratterman, who's done a lot of research work in that area. And then we came to post-Civil War, the Reconstruction Gilded Age period, all the way through World War II, and I did that. And tonight, what we're going to do is just have some fun. And this is a conversation about the history of Second from the time of Dr. William Clark, really up to the present, but with more of a focus on the earlier times. And when we were planning this, and Watson Courtney is here tonight, and he was one of the principal planners involved, we talked about Second's remarkable resiliency. And so hopefully that theme will go through tonight's conversation. With me on this panel, and I'll start over here on my left and move to the right, we have Kit Davis, who was baptized downtown at the old Second Presbyterian Church on Second and Broadway, and has grown as a result with the church through that period all the way up until the present, including, of course, the move to Rolling Fields. And then we have, to my immediate left, Jean Campbell. Like Kit, Jean is a member, or Kit has been a longtime member of the choir. Jean currently is retired for a while. We hope we can bring her back. But Jean was the 15-year-old girl during the tornado of 1974. So she remembers Second in different ways than, say, do I, who joined, I think, in 1979 and didn't grow up in Louisville. So all of this is new to me. To my immediate right is Ann Herman. Ann is a longtime member of the church since the days of Dr. Clark. Is that right, Ann? Yeah. And Ann has been a remarkable presence both on the session during the time of Glenn Doris, and also she raised her children here, and they were very involved. She had Fred, Chris, and Ann Jr., and then her husband Fred's daughter, Susie. All, I don't know what that is.
Folks, if you're online, could you mute your systems?
Did someone tune in? Okay. Anyhow, and then to my far right is Tom Terrell, who, like Kit, you weren't baptized here? Yeah, baptized in England, but since a little boy, a member of Second Presbyterian Church, both downtown and then here. And Tom has a remarkable history with the church not only as a father and a grandfather, and also the son of someone who was extremely influential in the life and history of the church. Now, I say all this with a lot of humility and trepidation, because as I look around the room, I see many, many people here who've been a member much longer than, well, not much longer, but longer than have I, and have different ways of interpretation and looking at events. And so we also want this to be a communal conversation, and I'm perfectly capable of wandering with a mic if you have questions, comments, things you want to add. This is not a lecture, this is a conversation. And it is a conversation about memory. Okay? Now, I also, before we get started, want to introduce Barrett's mom and dad who are here with us tonight. Nathan and Beth Abernathy are sitting right behind Joe and Holly. And we're delighted that Barrett's here and delighted that you all are here as well. Okay, let's get started. Tom, can you tell us about Dr. Clark and your father?
Well, they knew each other very well, and apparently Dad went and hired him, not like it is today, but just hired him in Scotland and brought him back.
Talk up to yeah.
Is that right?
That's better.
And as a little boy, one of the things I really didn't like doing was going to their house in the Highlands, because there was nothing for me to do. And Mrs. Clark scared me a lot. She wore dark clothes down to her ankles, but she was like you would expect an old Scottish lady. And
How did he sound? Did he talk?
I didn't understand anything he was saying. I mean, you know, and I would have been 3 or 4, 3 maybe, 4 years old when all this occurred. And we were just talking, one thing I remember as a young child sitting in here was when they got to the pastoral prayer, it lasted forever. I thought it was the longest boring thing. And I couldn't understand half of what he was saying. But, you know, I guess I learned something because I kept coming back. So here I am. I would say that they were very, you know, nice, and she was, I thought, she was difficult for a young boy to warm up to.
How did your dad meet Dr. Clark?
You know, I don't know how they met.
Your dad was rich.
Yeah, my dad was in the British Foreign Service, and they say, y'all said he hired in 1950. We were in China in 1950, so we came back in 51, but Dad went back and forth, so we might have done it. And my mother always kept to second press. I mean, that's where she grew up, was down there. And I saw him a lot more than, it was probably good for me.
And what are your memories of Dr. Clark?
Well, I thought he was delightful. He was a little short Scottish man, had a really dry sense of humor. And I was never at that time overwhelmed with his sermons. But over the years, I have found out that I am quoting Dr. Clark more than I do anybody else. One time, Dr. Clark said, so-and-so. One thing was, if you're going to walk with your head in the clouds, you better be sure your feet are firmly planted on the ground. I mean, that was one of his things. But he was a really nice man. He was a good pastor, but he was basically beside that, he was just a nice man. But he was a little different because he was Scottish. So, and he did have that Scottish brogue. And, but I love Dr. Clark.
During Dr. Clark's tenure, two very significant things happened. Not simultaneously, but close. Kit, do you want to take this one on?
We have a picture in a family album from the Courier Journal of my brother Fred Davis in a stroller, eating graham crackers, as the youngest person to be here for the groundbreaking. Mom must have really been desperate for something to do. But anyways, she thought it's over. And he was probably, that was probably the 53 or 54. And this church, this chapel itself came to be built. And at that time, there was conversation and some disagreement, as you might imagine. Louisville was moving in this direction. There weren't as many people living downtown at 2nd and Broadway, and to go to the church at 2nd and Broadway. And Dr. Clark, once this church was up and running, this chapel, he would do a 9:30 service downtown and then zip out here and do the same service at 11 o'clock. And so there was conversation about whether this was going to be a satellite church or whether we were going to move the congregation, and some people didn't want to, as you might imagine. And within a year or two, the old church burned down to the ground. Dr. Clark happened to be in the hospital under my father's care. He'd been in a wreck and he had broken ribs or a punctured lung or something, I don't know. But anyway, Daddy went in the next morning and he said, "So Padre, what did you think about the church burning down last night?" And Dr. Clark said in his Scottish accent, all I can say is I'm glad I'm in here so no one can accuse me of torching it. I remember long prayers and long sermons, yes. And the other thing I remember about that in the order of worship was that we always said the very same prayer of confession every Sunday. And it had the line, "And there is no life, and there is no health in us." I can remember one of the people in our youth group complaining bitterly about it later on. But anyway, he thought that was the wrong thing to say. We said the same prayer of confession, and Dr. Clark's prayer, a pastoral prayer, always included, certain phrases. He prayed for our country, for its leaders, and, those who administer our laws. I specifically remember that. But it seemed like it was the same, it was a very set. And that's the way Presbyterian churches worshiped in those days. I mean, we weren't any different.
It sounds as if it came straight out of the Scottish Book of Prayer, which is very, very much like the Episcopal Book of Prayer.
In some ways, probably. Yeah, in some ways, probably, yeah. But anyway, Dr. Clark he was really quite delightful. His office, the minister's office, was this little office right behind the organ. And then there's some other little rooms back here, which were secretarial offices and, an associate minister, which we called assistant at that stage of the game. The church was not air conditioned. Dr. Clark had a window air conditioner in his office. He occasionally invited our quartet, we didn't have an octet in the choir, we had a quartet that sang the first service. And they'd go in his office and just to cool off, and, I guess I won't say, he always had adult beverages in his office in case anybody needed it. So.
Scotch. Then let's move on as we're talking about the history to 1968, and Dr. Clark retires after 18 years, and into the church comes the next pastor who was here for 20, and that was the Reverend Glenn Doris. And all of us have, is there anyone here who was not here when Glenn was? Maybe that's the easier way to do it. Paul, Andrew, Linda Watson, and of course the Abernathys. Glenn, I'll start. Well, actually, Chet, you were in high school? Yeah.
I was a senior, going into my senior year. We installed him right here on Pentecost Sunday in May. He referred to himself as being 5'18". He was 6'6". Dr. Clark was approximately a foot shorter. And he got up to do the benediction, and Dr. Clark had always stood very quietly right here, and same size as the congregation, more or less. Glenn spread his arms, and he looked like an eagle taking off. We'd never seen anybody that big up here. But it was a new day, and he was incredibly well educated. He just finished a doctorate at Columbia, but he was well educated, and really preached some very interesting and well-researched sermons. He told my father one time that he had, for every 20 minutes that he preached, he studied and researched for an hour. You can imagine every week. That didn't leave a lot of time for the congregation. And that's when the associate pastor became the pastoral care person. Glenn didn't like hospitals. He was very upfront about it. And it made people mad.
Tell them about the golden age as you see it.
In the mid-70s, we ended up with a group of 3 ministers who were there during it was kind of Glenn's heyday. And that was Bill Arnold as our pastoral counselor, Harry Daniel, who oversaw the education for everything, the Christian education, and Glenn. And Bill ended up, his reputation just grew, and he was at the point where there were people from all over Louisville coming and saying, we want to talk to you. And he said, I'm being paid by this church. They said, well, we'll pay you. He said, no, I'm being paid by this church. I'm here to minister to them. But that was one of the ways that the idea for the Kilgore Center came to be, was sort of during Bill's years. And the door that goes down between the parlor and rooms 250 and 251, the one that goes down the steps and out to this parking lot, he designed that as the Bill Arnold escape hatch. And he said that the reason he did that was because if he had people in his office who were very upset, he didn't want to have them parading through the entire church and all of the people that were there. And he thought they needed a private place to leave, a private way to leave. But
he worked very closely with 3 congregants who had been through difficult divorces. And they wrote, as I recall, a handbook on marriage and divorce. And then both Bill Arnold and Harry Daniel left for very distinguished pastorates elsewhere. Bill ended up in my sister's church in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania for a while.
He's still a friend of ours.
yeah,
We communicated Christmas time.
He was wonderful. He is wonderful.
yes. Harry, and I think it's very important because this was 50 years ago, he did a whole series of talks and classes around the bicentennial in 1976. And they had to do with church history, but other history as well. And there were people from all over Louisville that came to those classes. It was really he was quite a good teacher.
Now, Gene, go ahead. I want to talk to Gene here about the next big event in the life of the church, which happened in early April 1974.
April 13th.
Oh, my goodness.
And Jean, tell us about the Louisville tornado and you and the church, and don't forget to use that wonderful phrase.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was in junior high when Kit was in high school. So she was my sister Lilibet, and I'm 6 years younger. So, and Sally's here. So Sally and I came up through here together. And this was such a wonderful church growing up in my younger years that it was.
Tell them where you lived.
You can see the house. I lived on Rolling Lane, the third house up. And when the tornado came through at 4:45, I was there with a TV repairman. That's a whole nother story. And 2 dogs, and watched the trees go by. I was in the kitchen making popcorn and didn't want it to burn. I was 15, so I don't know if that's an excuse or what, but the tornado came through, and as I was finally heading to the basement, the roof came off. It took half of the top floor, and I got to the basement. And when the TV repairman and I walked out, because we had a basement underground, so we could come out, which was great. His truck was wrapped around a tree in our backyard. And while he was checking on the truck, we had 2 dogs. I leashed them up and I brought them right into the foyer of the chapel, because to me, this was my safe place. And it was their safe place because people who were then coming out of their houses were going, there might be live wires, there might be, this, or there might be, they may be coming back. I don't know. There was just a lot to be said, and I didn't want them to just be stuck somewhere. And nobody's stuck when they're in the chapel. This is my church, through here, up here in the chapel. When the sanctuary was built, I mourned the loss of our football field.
Yes.
And our volleyball field.
Yes.
I graduated from high school in 76. In 76. And I know Sally and I talk about this often, but the sanctuary is beautiful, but it was on a beautiful piece of grass. And we had a lot of fun on that grass. And a hill covered with dandelions. But still, it was the neighborhood football field. It was.
Tell them about what, and Ann and Tom and Kit chime in here. Tell us about what the church did during this time of trauma.
Well, the Salvation Army had a man by the name of Major Mott who was driving down the street when this happened. He stopped and came in here, and this became the place. And everybody just sort of congregated here. And so we set up the kitchen and we started cooking meals because we had LG&E people and repair people everywhere. And with the Salvation Army's help, they did help a lot do this. And then a big generator was flown in from Fort Knox, and it's set right out there, I think. And so we had electricity. And there are certain things that I just don't forget. It wasn't a funny time, but you have to see some humor in it anyway. We had people washing dishes. I mean, it was just a constant thing going on. A lot of you probably remember Charlie Kastner. Charlie sat in front of that sink and washed dishes. I'll swear that's all he did was wash dishes. And the health department came in and didn't like the way Charlie was washing dishes. So they said he had to add Clorox to water, which was probably a good thing. And so Charlie continued to wash the dishes. And you all might remember Jan Harkus, Jan and Jim. Jim was the little Scotsman. But anyway, Jan decided, these men from LG&E and all the places that tree work were coming in and they were dragging mud in. So Jan gets a bucket of water and a mop, and she follows everybody around. And so we had clean floors.
She was the first member of the House and Gardens Committee.
We really did. We served,
But she worked really hard. But, you know, we got together as a church and everybody just really pitched in and helped. And it was rewarding in that sense because we could come together as a community and do something beneficial.
And what was the damage level? I know there were a lot around, but here to the facility, was there any damage?
you see the crosses in the doors? They were cracked. And there's a book called Tornado. It was published by the Courier after the fact. And that picture of the cross cracked is on the cover. There were, the back wall, yeah.
The bricks on the back wall.
Yeah, the back wall just got moved.
Yes.
But we had choirs of children downstairs. It was Wednesday afternoon. And we had seminary students who were teaching them at that stage of the game. And they literally went across the street on Pennington and were literally helping people, you know, peeling people off the walls of their houses, trying to get them out of their houses.
I mean, for the Abernathys who, and other people who weren't here, Sarah, for example, this tornado was really devastating for the city. You know, it did rolling fields, it went through Cherokee Park. What else?
Churchill Downs.
Churchill Downs, yeah.
The horse barns at the fairgrounds, you know.
In Northfield.
In Northfield, yeah. And it got Brandenburg too, as I recall. Yeah.
The Ohio. 650 tornadoes over a several hundred mile stretch. Went up to Cincinnati and Xenia.
And it got Xenia, that's right.
Oh, there were several tornadoes.
There were 100, I just did the research on it. There were 148 tornadoes that hit 13 states over the 3rd and the 4th. There were over 300 people killed, 70 of them in Kentucky, 86 in Alabama, actually was the most. There were over 6,000 people injured and over 9,000 homes and businesses destroyed.
Bottom line, it was devastation.
Well, the other thing I learned was it was after that whole group of tornadoes that the National Weather Service changed their whole warning system. And then also when we went from weather girls to meteorologists, meteorologists all of a sudden had to have education and training. And so the fact that you didn't know when you were making your popcorn, that's why, because
No surprise.
because
your TV wasn't working.
So the TV, the kitchen was on and it had a single frame on the TV that said tornado imminent. There was nobody talking, there was just a picture.
But what of the church, what feelings did you have about the church and its leadership and how the church came together during that period?
Bill Arnold was a big part. He was our youth group director.
Before he became an associate pastor.
Yes. He and Glenn both just kept making sure we were okay. I know several of us came just to talk to Bill about the effects of what happened to the church and what happened to our neighborhoods. And there is such a sense of community from everybody, all the workers, the Red Cross, all the people who were here. And I recall when Mom and I were working on the house, the National Guard were stationed so people wouldn't be looting in the neighborhood. And so we would regularly bring them milkshakes and things to eat, and they were very happy to be here and didn't it just seemed like everybody cared for everybody, and that was very helpful.
We really served several hundred meals every meal was several hundred people for about 10 days. I remember we had Palm Sunday in here. It was a very casual service. It was the first time I ever wore pants to church. In a service,
Let's move now from the tornado, and we've gone through a tumultuous time in the nation's history, because in 1968, nationally, we're dealing with the civil rights movement, we're dealing with the Vietnam War, and it was a time of social and political turmoil. And then we go into Watergate. What was that era like for you all? And what was the church's role, if any, in the political life of the nation?
Well, one of the things was that we fell out with the seminary. Until when Glenn came in 68, he said, we got to have youth ministers and, seminary students from the Presbyterian seminary. You can't have them from the one across the street. We are the largest Presbyterian church in the city, and we need to have a connection with them. In 67, when we did have some race riots and marches and so forth, there was marching on Alta Vista. And my great aunt died, and she was a member of Central Pres downtown. And we had the funeral was at the old Pearson's downtown. And the minister was very late. And Mr. Pearson looked at my mother and said, don't worry. 2 weeks ago, he came in. He was a half an hour late and he had a black eye, but he got here. And he'd been marching. And anyway, that was what was happening in Louisville in 1967.
And at that time, I guess the congregation was more conservative.
It was right before Dr. Clark retired.
Okay. And then, and Tom, what are your, Tom,
I was in college.
You were in college. Where did you go to school? I forgot.
65 through 69.
And were you a center? Right, and what was it like here during that time for you and for your husband, Fred?
I think at that time, I was probably so busy raising children that I was numb a lot of the time. But people had definite ideas, who marched, who didn't march. It was, there was some of that going on. But quite frankly, I don't remember a lot of hard feelings one person had toward another at that time. I just don't remember. I know people had their ideas and what was going on television, but I just didn't think we as a church were involved in any of that.
And it was, I think, at least from my viewpoint, it was more what went on within people's households.
Yes.
That, a younger teenager or a college kid might come home in bell-bottom jeans and not wear shoes, as I did one day in downtown Hopkinsville, and my father got wind of it, and immediately I was put in my place. But that's the sort of there were rebellions, but no, I can't imagine that it caused tension or unpleasantness within the walls of the church.
We had the Groves, who were members here, and their son was killed in Vietnam.
Who was that?
The Groves.
Oh, yeah, Fergus, right,
Groves.
Captain Groves.
They were raising those two grandsons. The mother had disappeared and early on, and one of them was my brother's age. But so I think they were we were, as a congregation, we were very supportive of them.
And it was very early. That was one of the early deaths in Vietnam in the early 60s, 63.
He was career military, I think.
We also had, did the Whaleys go to second at the time?
No.
But Mac Barr, who has rejoined second, but grew up here, saw fighting in Vietnam. That definitely you know, it was a very maturing experience for him. If you then move on, and now we're getting into Glenn's ministry. And Ann, would you talk to us about his preaching, his style, his favorite theme, and the things that made him a very important figure in the history of this church?
Well, Glenn was he thought everything out extensively, and he was very well educated. And I remember I was present with the women at that time, and by the way, we used to have very large women's groups here. And I thought the Bible study was just not very good that year. I just quite frankly didn't like it. So I went and talked to Glenn about it. And he said, well, let's think this thing through. And he said, what is, and after, I mean, it just didn't come off the top of his head. You know, we discussed it at length. And finally he said, what if one of his favorite topics was grace? He loved to talk about grace. And he said that he would do a series of sermons on grace. One Sunday a month, he would do one, and the women would have that as their Bible study for the women's group that month. And it meant a lot. I mean, he put a lot in it, and we had great Bible studies that year. But it was because of Glenn. And I found him very easy to work with, and he always had something worth listening to. And he made our Bible study that year a very big success.
Some of the important things historically that happened on his watch and that he had a lot to do with. The session for the first time had women, and ultimately it became almost half and half. The deacons were done away with and brought, and you had a 45-person session. He led, and you know, we focus on our ministers, and yet, I mean, you think of all the marvelous lay people who really raised the money or presided over the architectural drawings, etc. So it's unfair to them just to single out a minister, but this minister had an awful lot to do with the building, and the sanctuary was completed in 1980. So he would have been here 12 years then. So that is a very significant thing, not just the sanctuary, but the whole Sunday school row going down towards the sanctuary from this building.
And Glenn's office moved from that cubicle to where the parlor is now.
Where the parlor is now. And you were talking about his, the time that he spent, an hour for each minute of a sermon. There was the church library was here, but then Glenn had a little private library with no windows. And if he was in there working surrounded by books, you to leave him alone. Elizabeth.
He made me really mad because Kelsey and I were teaching Sunday school, and he said, I have no time for Sunday school.
Well, he told, my wife was the seminary.
I never forgot this.
Well, my wife was the seminary intern here when we met, and she invited him to come and talk to a youth group that she was shepherding, and he told her that he didn't do youth. And so that is, that's a sign of him that could be. Watson?
I was going to ask, the weekday school was established in that time. And that was, I always heard about, is that not right?
Yeah,
But there was a relationship.
56.
I thought Glenn had some sort of relationship with the weekday school.
He did have a relationship with the school, but it was It was more along the lines of, they needed, this sounds so awful, and believe me, in his own way, I loved it. But he felt that the weekday school needed to make a financial contribution to the church. I got that right, Edie?
Went after them.
Yeah.
They were very successful.
And Marty, Ann's mom was very involved.
My
Your
mother.
mother, I was in the section when it all was going on, and one of the most hilarious moments in my history with this church was the session was gonna hear a report on how to make the weekday school pay up. And the weekday school board came to the session meeting in its entirety. And it met in the room where the choir is, it was the amphitheater, but the amphitheater is no longer the amphitheater.
Yeah.
But the clerk of session and the senior pastor were sitting down at the bottom of the amphitheater, looking up, and it was like being in the lion's den there. And the weekday ladies, and it was an all-female board of very bright, politically savvy women.
And opinionated.
And strongly opinionated, with either children or grandchildren in the school, or they'd been off the board. And it was a sight to behold. And it wasn't until probably 15 years later that the weekday school started making financial contributions to the church, as did the Kilgore Samaritan Counseling Center. But anyhow, the thing also that Glenn had a lot to do with was the church's relationship with the seminary. He was on the seminary's board. He could match wits and temperament with anyone on that faculty. And many of them came here to worship. But if they were more socially to the left, then they probably would have gone to Highland or Crescent Hill. But a lot of the seminary faculty felt very, very comfortable here. And I'm thinking particularly of Harold Nevillesick and some of the others. Marty Swords, yeah. Yeah. I think the last 5 years of Glenn's ministry, and we're not going to be negative here, but it says something about the character of this church, I think, in those last 5 years or so, 6, 7, and tell them what it was like. Speak the truth in love.
That's what Snow's been put on the spot. I think Glenn got worn out. He was probably trying to do too much, and he needed some time off. He needed some time away from his work bed.
So he went to the manager clinic. Francis, his wife, went with him, and they were gone for about 6 months. And they came back, and he was different. There was a sadness. There was a bit of a resignation. So by resignation, I don't mean quitting. I mean just sort of not the energy that he had. The session was in a tumultuous time. I was clerk. Ann was on it. Kip, were you on it?
I was on it when we approved the sanctuary and
Yeah.
wondered where in the world the money was going to come from.
So all of this was swirling around, and there were people on the session who were restless and wanted more pastoral leadership, more say-so about what went on. And there was an executive committee of the session, and the executive committee was felt to be where most of the power was. And suddenly we were
Presbyterian did not authorize that.
yeah, and it was becoming, I think the rap and the trouble was suddenly there were divisions within the church. And to Ann's credit, and hopefully mine, we just sort of did our best not to take sides. Is that fair? I remember you being very fair. But with memory can do wonderful things. I think that with Glenn, what the point here is, the church learned how to minister to a pastor. Okay.
What time, is this the late 70s you're talking about?
No, this is late 80s. Bill, this would be maybe 84 to 88. Yeah.
When did he go red?
He came back from the manager.
I remember that.
After manager, they went to Hawaii and they dyed their hair red.
I just remember him coming back, and the first time we saw him in the pulpit, he shows up with bright red hair. The congregation was shocked.
It was really, yeah, but in fairness, we don't know what was going on. But those last 5 years were a downtime. I don't remember a lot happening. Kevin?
One of the things is that we had a succession of associate pastors. And they got younger and younger, and finally Presbytery said, no more. And that's when Rick King came. Because Glenn sort of did what he wanted to do, which was preach, and everything else fell on the associate pastor. And we got to the place, there wasn't a third one. And he was, the last person before Rick King came was Don Richter, who was straight out of Princeton Seminary. And he and Brett Morgan, yeah, and they did the best they could, but they were getting no guidance. And, I think he was tired. And Presbytery said, let's find some seasoned ministers here to help you out a little bit. And I think that was important for them to come and jump in and do that. So.
Is this the point in time that there was a substantial overspending in the architectural plan?
No, that comes later. We'll get to that. John, you get ready. Don't go there yet, but start. We'll get there on the overspending of the.
Charlie, speaking of overspending, what was the name of the trust we ended up with at PNC?
Lipscomb.
The Lipscomb Trust. Thank you. Because there was June Prince had a hilarious story about he himself and Joe Rhodes and Leonard Marshall, who was president of Liberty Bank at that stage of the game, sitting here with this mortgage on the sanctuary and the rest of the building, not the newest part, but a significant expansion, saying, how are we going to pay for this? And Glenn said, you just have to have faith. You've got to trust in God.
That's what Steve Chester said when we had.
Yeah, I know. But June and I were sitting in the Cabbage Patch board meeting one time. He was telling me this story, and he said, he sort of was like, yeah, but how are we going to pay this? And all of a sudden, Mr. Lipscomb, who I do not remember ever meeting him, died and left a huge bequest to the church, which we used for the mortgage. So, and then we paid it off.
And the Lipscomb Trust is still a substantial part of our endowment, right?
Income only.
Income only.
Income only, yes.
And it's managed by the terms by PNC.
Right.
So then Glenn retires in 1988. 88. And at the same time, the denomination changes in that the Southern Church and the Northern Church formally merge, and headquarters is moved here to Louisville. After Glenn, there is a period of about 2.5 years that is a time of mystery and confusion, in that there was a long search. And the committee had someone they really wanted, they thought the person was coming, and then right before that person was to be announced, the person changed.
Midnight, the night before Second Thoughts was going to be printed. A phone call.
We had then Victor Preby, who came in for about a year. And then Bill Phillippe came from Fifth Avenue, I think, or he'd been there and retired, came in, he did interims, and he was magnificent, and he did a great job getting the church through the interim period. The search committee then brought in the Reverend Robert Day Miller, and Robert came from denominational headquarters, and he had been head of, was it education or theology and worship? It was one of the big units.
But yeah, okay, he was there.
At the time, and he had been a college wrestler, and he had a wrestling mentality. I was his clerk as well.
He had the finesse of a ball-peen hammer, I thought.
Yeah.
He was preaching one time early on, and I don't think he thought a lot about people in this church really knew a lot about religion or whatever. And he says, well, okay, I'm going to recite the 23rd Psalm. And so, I don't know where that is. He says, if you don't know, it's on page 442 or something like that. I mean,
he talked down to us.
Yeah, he did. I mean, I stopped going for a while because he was just.
And you were not alone. It also was, all right, have you all ever heard of the goddess Sophia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This was another denominational issue. There was a group of women at denominational headquarters who did a milk and honey worship service that caused all kinds of attention, and because the rap on them was they were worshiping Sophia, that is wisdom, but they referred to her as the goddess Sophia somehow or another, and it made the next search after Robert, who I think deserves the title unintentional interim. I mean, think of it this way. We've had Tunis Gallons for 30 years, Dr. Clark you had Tunis for 27 years, Dr. Clark for 18, and Glenn for 20. Those are 3 super long pastorates. It was inevitable, I think, that whoever followed that bunch was going to be a short-term minister.
And we were also at that stage of the game. 1990, the spring of 1990 was the year that Jay Wilkie retired from the choir after 22 years. We're not even going to go into the end of that, but we were having an interim choir. Our organist, Jonathan Crutchfield, was pretty much taking over the choir and the programs, aided by our main soprano, Debbie Lawson. And within weeks of that all starting off, Debbie was in a horrible accident and was killed. And so, you know, the choir was kind of in disarray as well. And, you know, you're supposed to be, I mean, we've always looked at the choir as as a group that helps lead worship. And I think the choir members have always taken this very seriously. And there just wasn't any. You know, it was, I mean, the choir was upset, the congregation was upset. I was on session at that stage of the game. And the session meetings went till midnight, and then Ann and I would talk in the parking lot afterwards.
And I'll go out with a group of people for a beer. Because I was on session then too. I will say one thing, having been on session when Robert Miller was here, yes, there were things that he was not good at, but there were things that he was great at. He was a calming balm for people that needed that. And he had excellent pastoral care skills that were really needed at that time with some members of our congregation.
He did a very good, he was very pastoral with the choir when Debbie died.
I mean, that was his strength.
That's good.
And as someone who was a recipient of that, I have a real strong spot in my heart for him, because what he brought to us was something that Glenn Doris could never have done. And it was really needed at the time that he came.
There's also, I think you're right there, because I knew that quality of this. Also, I mean, you're dealing not only with theological issues in the church represented by this, you know, goddess Sophia thing, but you're also dealing with the beginning of the gay rights issues that were beginning at that point to be front and center in not only our denomination, but others. And Robert clearly was on the side of opening the church up, making it inclusive and welcoming to all. And remember, we're talking late 80s, early 90s. We're talking a very different time in this nation's history on how those issues were viewed and dealt with. So we called Holly.
You move on. I think you ought to mention why the choir master left.
Okay.
It was when my son left the church, because I believe it was the youth minister, Glaucia Vasconcelos, so that one.
Here's what the issue is. It's true. Glaucia was in the choir. I was her immigration lawyer, although I'd never done an immigration case in my life. And I kept saying to Glaucia, if you'll just find an American husband, you automatically will get your citizenship. And Glaucia said, no, thank you. No. Au contraire. Glaucia said no. That there was no one she was interested in, and that was out of the question.
She had come to Louisville from Canada.
And yeah, by way of originally from Brazil.
But she had been at the seminary with her first husband.
The
Baptist seminary. By the time they lived in Canada, she was in an abusive relationship. There was no doubt about that. And she came to Louisville sort of overnight. And, you know, and Jay had been her teacher, and she knew.
To Glenn Doris's credit, he came to me and said, this woman needs immigration help. You're going to become an immigration lawyer. You need outside expertise. My son, I can find a firm in Atlanta that can answer specific questions. And Glenn was totally behind that. And meant it in a very kind of way. Well, what happened was that Glaucia And Jay Wilkie, the choir director who'd been here for a long, long time, had an affair. And then he announced his retirement.
Jay.
And there was a huge celebration. We took up a big collection and about $5,000. And then he accepted it. Everyone was happy. He left. And the next day, his wife called and said he'd left her and had run off with Glaucia. And they both disappeared. And then again, up to Robert Miller's credit, Robert forced him to give the money to his wife. And that is something never to be forgotten. So that's that sad, terrible story that I wasn't sure we'd get into tonight, but we're not defaming anybody.
It's affected the young people who.
Yeah, it was hard on the young people.
Well, her daughters were in high school and in the choir and so forth. Yeah.
But let's move now from that period to the next. And Barrett, here, we called in the Alban Institute for Counseling. And the Alban Institute, we brought them in. It's no longer around, but it was a very skilled outfit, a nonprofit headed up by a man named Speed Lees, who came in and they took soundings of people in the congregation because it was a hot mess.
It was 1994.
And it was done for two reasons: to let people vent, but also to give us sort of an insurance policy in the next search, so that a minister looking at us would say, they're not so bad. They can, they got counseling. I can work with them.
They've worked on their problems.
Yeah. And we did bring them in before you, Barrett. Apologies.
No problems.
So then we have a search committee. Well, we have a glorious interim minister in the form of Henry Mobley, who was the retired minister of Highland Presbyterian. This was a wonderful thing for second, because he was a gentle, funny, anything goes. You want to do this project, you want to take that on, go right ahead. And he had a search committee formed by popular vote, one after the other. So there were
Sunday after Sunday.
There were 10 people on the search committee who didn't always get along. There was no thought given as to how they would work together. But and I was on it and chaired it, we coalesced and over time learned, one, that the members of the search committee should guide the search, and their wives or husbands cannot be part of the search in abstention. That was an important lesson to learn. I'm not talking about Elizabeth. Then we had, I think it was 14 months of search. We were very hand in glove with the Committee on Ministry at Presbyterian. And we brought in Steve Litch. And if you take the Litch pastorate of 10 years and the Juster pastorate of 15 years, I think that you have an era of good feeling in the life of the church. Both men, very pastoral, both men gentle. The former more introverted, the latter extreme extrovert.
I just always refer to him as Steve first and Steve second.
And during Steve the First's reign, we did the gym. So the weekday school underneath. And the office wing where Eric's office and Jim Rittenhouse, where they are now. And then with, I think that is when we raised $4.5 million to do that. And the session spent $7 million. And it was hard enough to raise the 4.5. That caused some cantankerous feelings. Enter Mr. Cleanup, John Singer, and others who raised, and this is important, you helped a lot. Raised, I mean, you took on and basically said, we got to raise the money to pay off this debt. And we did, remember? You did. You hit me up. Anyway, but that's kind of, I think, a good way to happen there. And what are, you know, now we've taken you through Steve 1 and Steve 2 in a nutshell. Where do you all want to go with this? We've got another 5 minutes, I think, to wrap this up. Linda?
I'm just curious.
And speak up so people can hear
I'm
you.
curious what the membership has been through these various waves.
Fluctuated between about 1,200 and 1,300.
Consistently.
It's a lie. I'm looking at the membership rolls right now. It's so many inactive members. I mean,
There were 1,500.
oh, there were 1,650 members on that list as of February.
We cut it down.
Oh, so it did get up to 1,500?
It was 1,500.
Couple years ago.
1,500 something. We cut it down to like 1,200 is probably.
It was back up to 1,650 by February.
Really?
It had people who had never been members. It had former clergy. It had former office workers. It's just the software and all the untrained people that thought they were doing the best they could. And,
Mostly children who had joined
yeah.
and no longer live in Louisville. But one thing I want to say about the chapel, and you were involved, and we did it again. I always thought it was the chapel was Dr. Clark's building. Because it's like a Spain, it's like a Scottish kirk. There's no stained glass, there's no anything. It's just a simple church. And so I look at the other sanctuary as Dr. Doris's church. To me, this is Dr. Clark's church.
That's a nice way to put it.
That really happened.
And it really does look, and Ann had a lot to do with this. The way you see it now is very much the way I've been told it worked when it was first built. Yeah. And in its simplicity and it's sort of timeless. Thank you.
Sarah's got a question.
Sarah?
Yeah. At what point, what decade, or under whose leadership were the kids the most involved?
Oh, we talked about that.
Yeah, we did.
It's completely different.
Gene, you were a child.
Kid and I, we grew up the same way.
Yeah, we grew up with, you know, Sunday school and lots of teachers and lots of people.
And the teachers were all men.
Well, lots of them were. When you were really little, there were some ladies that helped.
Miss Affleck took care of it.
Betty and Preston Young, both of them, various Mrs. Palmerballs, you know, but each division, you know, primary, middle school, and or junior highs and senior highs, everybody met separately at 9:30. But within that group, there was a short worship service. We had a piano player who came from section to section, and that's how we learned the hymns of the church. And we took up a little collection and did some Bible verses, and then you went into your, you know, your 4th grade class or your 2nd grade class, and you know, each one of those had a teacher. Youth group was, by the time That's when we went, about the time I was entering senior highs, was about the time that we gave up on Presbyterians, I think, for a while. And we went over to the Baptist seminary, and we had a couple of young men from there. And then my senior year, I was on the committee at the seminary with Glenn to choose, it was vocation night or whatever they called it. I can't remember. Anyway, you interviewed a series of students come be your, and there was a committee from here. And you interviewed a series of students and kind of chose the ones that you thought would fit the best. They were hopeless, every single one of them. And they were gone by December. Glenn said, this was a mistake, sorry. And that is when Bill Arnold came. He was back here doing a doctorate with Wayne Oates at the other seminary, but you know, whatever. He was a good Presbyterian. And he agreed to come be the youth group director. And then eventually he left and then came back as an associate pastor. But there were big Sunday school classes, there were big youth groups. Yeah.
We had a marvelous youth group.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
it's
huge.
Would you agree that Bill Arnold was the one that really focused on the kids?
Yes.
Because I remember working with
It was
Bill.
very interesting. He loved the senior highs and he couldn't stand the junior highs, but Harry Daniel loved the junior highs. So they worked that out really well.
And they worked well together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was in youth group, Gina and I were in youth group during that time.
Yeah. But we were talking earlier about all the different hands-on mission projects that this church did that the children participated in. You know, we brought canned food for Bellwood at Thanksgiving. We brought a present for a person our own age for the Cabbage Patch at Christmas. You know, it was, I mean, there were a lot of things that we did. Anne remembers a picnic at Bellwood. And we also had a group of doctors from this church who went out and did the annual physicals for all the orphans at Bellwood.
Folks, we got to close it down. Jennifer, one last question.
It was later when they started doing adult education, correct? When did that?
Well, actually, if you read the Lou Weeks history of adult education, goes all the way back to the beginning of the church. And there were all kinds of adult education classes over the years. And it just kept going.
When I was growing up, there were two classes. There was issues, which was more current events, and that's where all the arguments started. And then there was a Bible study class. And then, you know, that sort of filtered out. And I think more about the time Glenn came, we started to have a few more classes. He looked at our little calendar that was in the bulletin every Sunday, and he said, there's 6 things going on at this church this week. Look at this big building. Why are we here? That's when we started having, opening up to AA and all sorts of other groups that came in during the late 60s and 70s.
There was a scout troop as well.
Well, there were always scout troops.
Right. You all, thank you so much. I hope this has been helpful. Tom just said, we've been here by the grace